significant implications for India-US trade relations. US President Donald Trump has announced a new tariff policy under Section 301 of the US Treaty of 1974, imposing a 10% tariff on goods that are imported from India and 16 other nations over concerns related to the use of forced labor in global supply chains. While the move introduces an additional duty on Indian exports, it also brings some relief as India was initially expected to face a 12.5% tariff when the proposal was unveiled in June. However, after New Delhi amended its foreign trade policy in order to prohibit the import of goods produced using forced labor, Washington reduced India's tariff rate to 10%. The decision was announced through a memorandum that was issued by President Donald Trump. He said that nations that have taken concrete steps to prohibit imports made using forced labor deserve a lower tariff rate, adding that the revised tariffs are intended to encourage stronger enforcement while continuing efforts to combat forced labor in the global trade. The tariffs were formally announced by U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson, who confirmed that the U.S. has imposed new duties on imports from 60 nations under Section 301 of the Trade Act. The decision comes just before the expiry of the temporary 10% universal tariff that was introduced earlier this year after the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Donald Trump's earlier reciprocal tariff policy. And under the new framework, countries that have introduced laws banning imports produced through the forced labor will face a 10% tariff, while nations without such legal safeguards, including China, Japan, and several others, will face a 12.5% tariff. India is among the 17 nations placed in the lower tariff category alongside Canada, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka and the United Kingdom. The remaining 43 nations covered under the investigation will face the higher tariff. And the new duties officially come into effect at 12:01 a.m. on Friday. And according to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, the action follows a months-long investigation into whether America's trading partners were effectively preventing imports made using forced labor. Jamieson described the move as both a human rights initiative and a trade policy measure, saying that it aims to address forced labor while correcting trade distortions that disadvantage American workers and manufacturers. And a major reason India secured the lower tariff was the amendment made to the foreign trade policy on July 14, formally prohibiting the imports of goods produced using forced labor. The U.S. government acknowledged this policy change while finalizing the tariff structure, and although the reduction from 12.5% to 10% appears modest, trade experts say that it carries important diplomatic significance, signaling that Washington is willing to recognize policy reforms undertaken by its trading partners while continuing to demand stronger enforcement. The announcement also comes at a crucial time as India and the U.S. continue negotiations on a broader bilateral trade agreement. Well, earlier this year, both the nations agreed on a framework under which tariffs on Indian exports were expected to be reduced from an effective 50%, including penalties that were linked to India's purchase of Russian oil to around 18% under a future trade arrangement. And in return, India reportedly proposed purchasing $500 billion worth of American goods over the next 5 years, while expanding market access for selected U.S. exports, including agricultural products. Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal had earlier said that India viewed the proposed tariff framework positively because it would provide Indian exporters with a competitive advantage over several neighboring and Southeast Asian economies. However, the U.S. Supreme Court's decision striking down the earlier reciprocal tariff regime has created uncertainty over how these negotiated tariff arrangements will eventually be implemented. Another concern for New Delhi is that India remains subject to two separate Section 301 investigations. And apart from the forced labor probe, India is also facing another investigation that is related to the alleged excess manufacturing capacity. Trade experts warn that if competing nations such as Pakistan and Sri Lanka ultimately face lower overall tariff rates than India, Indian exporters could lose some of their competitive edge in the American market. Former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative Mark said both the nations appear close to finalizing an interim trade agreement, but India is seeking clarity on whether it will ultimately receive more favorable tariff treatment than the competing economies. And the new tariff policy also contains several exemptions, as according to the U.S. government, the additional duties will not apply to raw materials whose restriction could create shortages in the domestic supply. Products that could cause economy-wide disruptions or goods that cannot be produced in sufficient quantities within the U.S. have also been kept outside the scope of the tariffs. And despite the latest move, the United States remains one of India's most important economic partners. And it is India's second largest trading partner and the country's largest export destination. And according to the official trade data, bilateral goods trade between India and the US reached nearly $141 billion in 2025, with Indian exports valued at approximately $87.3 billion, highlighting the significance of the US market for the Indian businesses. Well, reports also suggest that the Donald Trump administration could introduce another round of tariffs in the coming weeks, targeting nations accused of subsidizing excess manufacturing capacity. And since India remains under a separate Section 301 investigation on that issue, New Delhi could again come under the scrutiny. And for now, India has managed to reduce its proposed tariff from 12.5% to 10% after making policy changes on the forced labor. And while that offers some relief, the broader trade negotiations between New Delhi and Washington remains crucial. And with fresh investigations underway and a comprehensive trade agreement still under the discussions, the coming weeks are expected to play a decisive role in shaping the future of India-US trade relations and the competitiveness of Indian exports in one of the most important global markets.